When a caring teacher quietly observes a newly enrolled boy in her class, she first notices his downcast gaze and the way he winces whenever he stretches his arm. At first, she suspects he might just be shy or recovering from a minor accident, but with every passing day, the bruises on his arms and the shadows in his eyes tell her a much darker story. Before we dive into what happens next, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of compassion, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Sarah Carter often found herself reflecting on her decades in the classroom. She'd seen countless bright smiles, messy crayons, and giggling children making paper airplanes in the back row. Her room, once a mosaic of chalk dust and laughter, had changed in certain ways over the years. Technology had crept in, with interactive whiteboards replacing chalkboards, and kids sometimes seemed more engrossed in tablets than in the joys of reading. Yet Sarah never lost the steady, gentle warmth she was known for, or the ability to notice the small but crucial details that signaled a child might be in trouble. She had learned to pay close attention to the unspoken signs, those subdued pleas for help that manifested in a lowered gaze or a hurried gesture to cover a bruise. It was the start of the school year in early September when she met Daniel Wells. The class had just settled in. Children lined the rows of bright desks, some nervously fidgeting, others already chatting with the excitement of a fresh start. Daniel, new to the district, caught her eye right away because he lingered near the door, as though reluctant to enter. His posture was tense. He walked with his arms close to his sides, like he wanted to be as small as possible. Sarah recalled that initial moment with a pang of concern. He didn't quite meet her gaze when she welcomed him. Instead, he forced a polite nod and spoke so quietly she had to bend down just to hear his name. On that very first morning, she tried to engage him during a simple icebreaker game. Each student was supposed to share something they liked about summer break. Most of them offered up cheerful anecdotes about swimming pools, camping trips, or visiting cousins in neighboring states. When Daniel's turn came, he hesitated, looked at his shoes, and mumbled something about helping at home. Sarah gently prompted him with an encouraging smile, but he only shook his head. She could feel the entire class shifting its attention to him, that dreaded spotlight. A few kids whispered, but nobody pressed him. Right then, Sarah's instincts whispered that something about his body language was off. It was more than just the nerves of being the new kid. During recess, as the children rushed out to the playground, Daniel asked if he could stay inside. "Of course you can," she said softly, her curiosity piqued. He lingered at his desk, pretending to be immersed in a book. Sarah tried to strike up a conversation, but his answers came short. She noticed a faded yellowish bruise on his forearm, partially hidden by the rolled-up sleeve of his shirt. She asked if he'd had a rough tumble, but he just shrugged and said, "I'm clumsy." Even so, she couldn't miss the fear in his eyes when she mentioned sending a nurse to check it out. He insisted he was fine, pulling his sleeve down abruptly. That night, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about him. The quiet tension, the reluctance to speak, the bruise. She had seen bruises on kids before. They were typically accompanied by animated stories of falling off bikes or colliding on a soccer field. She recalled the subtle difference in Daniel's expression. It wasn't the embarrassment of taking a tumble, it was something else, something guarded. The next morning, she greeted him at the classroom door again, hoping that a warm smile and a friendly nod might ease some of his wariness. He nodded back but seemed to drift to a desk in the far corner as if he wanted to go unnoticed. 3 days passed, and Sarah took notes each time something caught her eye. On Wednesday, she saw him wincing while carrying his backpack, as though the straps were pressing on sore spots. On Thursday, he flinched when one of the other students patted him on the shoulder to ask a question. On Friday, she noticed he never wore a short-sleeve shirt, even though the weather was still balmy and every other child seemed to revel in the last stretch of summer's warmth. By the start of the second week of school, she couldn't deny the strong intuition that Daniel was dealing with more than just social anxiety. As the days went by, Sarah found small opportunities to learn more about Daniel. She discovered that his last name, Wells, was actually the surname of his foster family, Frank and Ruth Wells. The name was familiar in the sense that she'd heard it mentioned once or twice in the teacher's lounge. Apparently, they were well-regarded foster parents in the community, known for taking in children who had nowhere else to go. Sarah had never met them personally. Perhaps they had brought Daniel here hoping for a fresh start. It didn't take long for her to notice that the phone number on his registration form was a landline, which was somewhat unusual in an era dominated by cell phones. When Sarah called that number one afternoon to leave a message about a small project Daniel had missed, a woman's stern voice answered, curtly confirming she'd relay the message. The exchange was so brief it left Sarah unsettled, but she couldn't place why. Mr. Henderson, a retired social worker who volunteered in the school library, popped into her classroom occasionally to talk about reading programs. Tall, with a gentle expression and a voice that never rose above a calm murmur, he had a knack for drawing out children who were too shy to speak to anyone else. Sarah confided in him about her concerns for Daniel. She mentioned the boy's bruises, his withdrawn demeanor, and his startling flinches. Mr. Henderson frowned and said, "It might be nothing, but keep an eye on him." Sarah sensed that he, too, suspected more. He promised to invite Daniel to the library next time they had free reading hour, to see if he could get a better read on him. Later that week, the school counselor, Mrs. Garcia, joined Sarah in the cafeteria for lunch. She was known to be empathetic, calm under pressure, and thorough in her approach to family troubles. Sarah brought up Daniel's situation in the same hushed tone she'd used with Mr. Henderson. She feared overreacting but also worried about ignoring warning signs. Mrs. Garcia listened intently, tapping a pen against her notebook. "I'll schedule a casual chat with him," she said. "No direct interrogation, just a check-in. If there's something going on at home, maybe he'll open up." Daniel, however, seemed determined to keep to himself. When Mrs. Garcia asked how he was settling in, he politely said everything was fine. When she gently probed about his family, he said, "They're good to me," and that was the end of it. Sarah watched these interactions from a distance with a combination of relief and trepidation, torn between her hope that maybe there wasn't actually a problem and her growing certainty that Daniel was hiding something. By the fourth week of school, Sarah began to see more bruises. Some looked older, fading into that greenish-brown color. Others were new, purple or red. None were in places typically associated with childhood scrapes. She noticed them around his upper arms and once, a faint outline on his wrist that looked like somebody might have gripped him too hard. The tension in her heart grew each time she saw him rubbing those marks discreetly, as if trying to soothe them away when no one was looking. One afternoon, during silent reading, Sarah quietly approached Daniel's desk and kneeled beside him. "Daniel," she said gently, "I just want to make sure everything is okay at home. It's all right if you don't want to talk right now, but I'm worried about you. If there's anything you need, you can let me know." He lifted his eyes from the page, and for a second, she saw tears brimming. Then, almost instantly, he blinked them away. "I'm fine," he whispered, putting on a brave face that looked far too worn for a child his age. At home that evening, Sarah tried to distract herself by cooking a warm meal and watching a light-hearted show on television. She couldn't get Daniel out of her mind. She remembered seeing children in distress during her career, but not many with injuries that resembled those she suspected were inflicted by another person. She found herself replaying every conversation she'd had with him, every time she'd seen him flinch. She wanted to reach out to someone, but she hesitated, afraid of making an accusation that could upend a family's life if she was wrong. Still, the thought of Daniel suffering gnawed at her conscience. The following day, she made her concerns more explicit to Mrs. Garcia. "There's something definitely going on," Sarah said in a low, urgent tone. "I see new marks on him almost every other day. These bruises aren't from playground accidents, I'm certain." Mrs. Garcia's expression turned grave. "I can't launch an investigation just on suspicion alone, but we can keep notes, compile any evidence, and perhaps talk to the foster parents. If I see or hear anything directly from Daniel that corroborates abuse, We'll have more to go on. That weekend, Sarah visited the local grocery store and ran into one of the second-grade teachers. The conversation drifted to the subject of foster care in their community. The teacher mentioned the Wells family, praising them for hosting foster children in the past. They keep to themselves, she noted, but I've never heard anything bad. They seem strict though. I've seen the dad scolding a child in the parking lot once. Sarah nodded, but the unease in her stomach only increased. Something told her that Daniel wasn't the first child who had ended up in that house with unexplained bruises. The next Monday came with a drizzle of rain, and Daniel arrived at school drenched. The rest of the students either had umbrellas or parents who dropped them off at the entrance. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like he'd walked half a mile through puddles. Sarah immediately handed him some paper towels. He accepted them with trembling hands. She expected him to take off his soaked jacket, but he kept it on, as though clinging to it for protection. During math class, Sarah realized Daniel wasn't writing anything in his notebook. She quietly approached, noticing his hands were visibly shaking. "Are you cold?" she asked. He nodded. "Could I get you something dry?" "Another sweater from the lost and found." He hesitated, then nodded again. She signaled for him to follow her into the hallway. There, away from the other students' eyes, she helped him slip out of his rain-soaked jacket. As she pulled it off, she caught sight of a fresh bruise on his lower forearm, shaped almost like a handprint. It looked recent, as though someone had grabbed him roughly. Her heart lurched. Daniel caught her staring and quickly tugged down his sleeve. She gave him the sweater, pressing her lips together to contain her alarm. He mumbled a quiet thank you. She wanted so badly to ask him right then who did that to him, but she could see the fear in his eyes and knew he'd deny it. Anger and heartbreak warred in her mind. How could the system place a child in a home where he was potentially being hurt? She resolved to talk to Mr. Henderson that very afternoon. When the final bell rang, Daniel left in a hurry, as though he couldn't wait to escape the school. Sarah watched him from her window, walking alone in the drizzle. She wondered why his foster parents weren't picking him up. Mr. Henderson came by just then, a stack of library books cradled in his arms. Sarah waved him over and confided the latest incident with the handprint-shaped bruise. He sighed heavily. "I've seen this before, Sarah. Back when I was working cases, I learned that some families only appear strict on the outside but cross lines behind closed doors." They decided it was time to discuss the matter with the principal. Principal Madeline Clark was new to the school, having arrived just a few months prior. She listened to Sarah and Mr. Henderson with polite attentiveness but seemed uneasy about taking drastic action. "We have to be cautious," she said. "We can't risk accusations without solid evidence. Have we contacted the parents to ask them for an explanation?" Sarah bristled at the suggestion. It was often the case that abusers found ways to lie or punish the child further if they were cornered. Still, Principal Clark insisted on a direct conversation with the Wells. That evening, Sarah made the call. Ruth Wells answered with the same curt tone Sarah remembered from before. Sarah explained that she was concerned about Daniel's well-being and his frequent bruises. Ruth responded with measured outrage. "Are you implying we abuse him? Daniel is a clumsy boy. He's always tripping over himself. That's why he has bruises." Her voice turned shrill. "And how dare you call me about this without proof?" Sarah tried to keep calm, reminding herself that she was doing the right thing. "We just want to make sure Daniel is safe," she said. "If there's anything we can do to help him adjust." Ruth cut her off. "He's fine. He just needs discipline. He's been through a lot, you know, bouncing from one home to another." Then she hung up abruptly. Sarah put down the phone, her hands shaking. She glanced out her living room window. Outside, the rain pelted the glass, a relentless drumbeat that matched her roiling thoughts. She dialed Mrs. Garcia and relayed the conversation word for word. "We'll keep documenting," Mrs. Garcia said. "If Daniel shares anything, we'll file a formal report with Child Protective Services." Over the next few weeks, The tension in the classroom seemed to deepen. Daniel spoke even less, if that were possible. He avoided other children, flinching at any attempt to include him in group games or projects. Sarah noticed how quickly he packed up at the end of the day and how he seemed to vanish into the crowd of students streaming out the front door. On a particularly chilly morning in late October, she saw him arriving without a coat. She rushed to his side, alarmed that he was shivering in just a thin, short-sleeve shirt despite the dropping temperature. "Where's your jacket, Daniel?" she asked. He kept his gaze on the ground and mumbled something incoherent. At lunchtime, she found him sitting alone, poking at the food on his tray. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, and he stiffened before looking up at her with tired eyes. "Did you forget your coat at home?" she asked. He shrugged. "Ruth took it away," he said quietly. "She said I shouldn't be careless. I left it in the hallway, so she said, I didn't deserve it today." Sarah felt her stomach churn. This kind of punitive action might seem minor to some, but it was another clue that the environment he lived in was harsh, if not outright abusive. No guardian should withhold something as essential as a warm coat from a child in cold weather. She offered him a sweater from the lost and found again. He accepted with a muttered thank you. A few days later, Daniel was absent. Then another day passed, and he still didn't show. Sarah called the foster home to inquire about him. No one answered. She left a message, but her call was never returned. The principal's secretary also tried calling, but there was radio silence. By the third day, Sarah was frantic with worry. Had something happened to him? Had the Fosters withdrawn him from school? Late that afternoon, the office phone finally rang. It was Ruth Wells, stating Daniel had the flu and would return when he recovered. No further details. Sarah asked if he needed homework or reading materials. Ruth brusquely declined, saying Daniel would catch up later. When Daniel finally reappeared, he was more withdrawn than ever. Sarah noticed a large bruise on his cheek, barely concealed by a bandage. She pulled him aside discreetly and asked, "Daniel, what happened? Did you fall?" He nodded wordlessly. She waited, hoping he'd say more, but he remained silent, eyes cast downward. She gently said, "You can trust me. If someone hurt you, you can tell me." He swallowed and shook his head. Mr. Henderson tried a different approach one afternoon by inviting Daniel into the library under the pretense of needing help shelving books. There, away from the hustle of the classroom, Mr. Henderson chatted about random topics, favorite authors, cartoons, and new hobbies. Daniel responded with polite but minimal answers. Then Mr. Henderson mentioned his past work in social services and how he used to help kids who felt unsafe. Daniel's eyes darted to him, lingering for a moment before he quickly looked away. "If you ever want to talk about anything at home," Mr. Henderson said softly, "I'm here. And so is Ms. Carter." Daniel gave a tiny nod, but no more. Days trickled into weeks, and the routine carried on. Students did their morning exercises, recited the Pledge of Allegiance, and delved into math and reading lessons. Meanwhile, Sarah's concern for Daniel gnawed at her, manifesting as sleepless nights and restless pacing. She began documenting every bruise, every unusual absence, every cryptic statement. Mrs. Garcia did the same, keeping a log in her office. Despite the principal's caution, Sarah consulted with Mr. Henderson on the possibility of calling Child Protective Services. But they both knew that a mere suspicion without direct testimony from Daniel or ironclad proof could end up going nowhere. Worse, it could tip off the Fosters, leading them to isolate Daniel further. Just as Sarah was beginning to feel helpless, a conversation with another teacher gave her an idea. The teacher mentioned that occasionally children confide in a diary or journal when they can't speak out loud. Sarah decided to have the class participate in a journaling project, hoping Daniel might express himself in writing if he couldn't do so verbally. She handed out blank notebooks, instructing the kids to write a short entry each day about anything they felt like. Hobbies, feelings, even frustrations. She emphasized that no one else would read them except for her, and only if they were comfortable sharing. Most kids scribbled half-hearted entries about what they ate for lunch or how bored they were. Daniel, however, wrote nothing on the first few days. One rainy afternoon, Sarah found Daniel lingering at his desk after everyone else had dashed out for lunch. He seemed to be studying his blank journal. She approached cautiously and asked if he had any trouble getting started. He looked up with an unreadable expression and whispered, "I don't know what to write." Sarah gently suggested, "You could start with how your day went, something good that happened, something bad. Anything you want to say, even if you don't want me to read it. It can just be for you." He nodded, though he still appeared torn. She left him to it, hoping that the silent pages might eventually become a safe space for him to confide his fears. Another stormy night arrived, bringing a fierce wind that rattled the windows in Sarah's home. She tried to read before bed but found she couldn't focus. Her mind kept wandering to Daniel, imagining him alone in that foster house, shivering without a coat. She wondered how many other children might have passed through the well's doors, subjected to the same or worse. The next morning, she discovered that Daniel had left a short note in his journal, one that nearly brought her to tears. "Sometimes I get scared at home. I try to be good, but it's not enough." She showed it to Mrs. Garcia, who agreed it was a significant step, but still not enough to make a solid case for CPS. They needed more definitive evidence. Sarah felt a pang of guilt for even thinking in legal terms. This was a child who was clearly in distress. Shouldn't that be enough? But she knew that the system demanded more. That very day, she wrote a detailed entry in her own journal, capturing the date, her observations, and Daniel's words. If nothing else, she would build a chronological account so that, if the situation escalated, they would have a record. Shortly after, the first parent-teacher conference of the year approached. Sarah requested to meet with Ruth and Frank Wells. She hoped a face-to-face conversation might yield more clues or, at the very least, confirm her suspicions. They arrived, sharply dressed, with Frank in a suit and Ruth wearing a conservative blouse and skirt. Her features were as severe as her tone on the phone. The meeting began uneventfully, with Sarah going over Daniel's academic progress, praising his intelligence despite his reticence. Frank nodded impatiently, while Ruth's gaze roamed the classroom as though looking for something to criticize. Sarah then broached the subject of Daniel's well-being, mentioning the bruises and her concerns about his withdrawn behavior. Ruth sniffed disdainfully. "He's a fragile boy. He's been bounced around from home to home," she said. Frank added, "We're trying our best to instill discipline. Children need structure. Sometimes he cries or resists chores, but that's normal for kids who haven't had proper parenting before." Sarah felt her temper rise at their casual dismissal, but she kept her composure. She asked if they thought therapy might help. Ruth gave a tight smile. "We'll consider it if necessary, but right now we have our own methods. We believe in tough love." That phrase hung ominously in the air. After they left, Sarah exhaled, her shoulders tense. She recounted every second of that meeting to Mrs. Garcia. "They're hiding something," she insisted. Mrs. Garcia nodded solemnly. She suggested that if they gathered more physical evidence, like photographs of the bruises, they might have a stronger case. Sarah felt uneasy about secretly taking pictures of a child's injuries, but she agreed it might become necessary if Daniel wouldn't or couldn't speak out. A few days later, a slip of paper fell out of Daniel's journal while Sarah was tidying up the desks. She recognized his messy scrawl, "It hurts sometimes, but I can't tell." That same afternoon, Daniel's foster parents picked him up early for an unknown reason, which only deepened her worry. She decided to mention the note to Mr. Henderson, who was equally alarmed. "Sarah, maybe the time has come to contact CPS directly," he said. She wrestled with the decision. She had enough partial evidence, her logs of bruises, the journal entries, to suspect abuse, but would it hold up when confronted with the well's respectable facade and plausible explanations? She arranged a discreet meeting with a local CPS representative named Ms. Taylor. In a private conversation, Sarah shared her notes, her concerns, and Daniel's few written confessions. Ms. Taylor listened attentively, taking notes. "I'll open a case," Miss Taylor said gently. "We'll have to do a home visit. But understand, Miss Carter, if Daniel denies the abuse when we talk to him, and the Wells appear cooperative, there may not be much more I can do. Still, I'll see what I can find." That weekend, Sarah received a call from Miss Taylor. The social worker explained that the initial visit to the Wells home presented no clear evidence of neglect or physical abuse. The house was tidy, the fridge was stocked, and Daniel wouldn't say anything against them, Miss Taylor said. "He just looked down and said he was fine." Sarah's heart sank. She felt a mix of frustration and sadness for Daniel, who was likely terrified of repercussions if he spoke out. Miss Taylor added, "We can keep the case open and monitor the situation, but there's not enough to remove him from the home. Let me know if you observe any escalation." Sarah found herself in an agonizing position. She continued to see suspicious bruises appear on Daniel, yet there was no direct confession from him that he was being harmed. One morning he came to school with a limp. When she asked him if he hurt his leg, he merely nodded and said he fell off his bike. She didn't see a bike helmet or any sign that he'd actually been biking. The limp persisted for days, and she pressed him to visit the nurse, but he refused, anxious and nearly in tears at the suggestion. It was a heartbreaking reminder of how deeply fear can root itself in a child's mind. One cold day in November, just before Thanksgiving break, a particularly chilling event occurred that left no doubt in Sarah's mind about the severity of Daniel's predicament. As she arrived at school early to prepare lesson materials, she found Daniel huddled by the front entrance. His hair was wet with frost, his jacket nowhere in sight. When she bent down to ask what happened, he burst into muffled sobs. I had to leave," he stammered. "He kicked me out last night." Sarah's blood ran cold. She ushered him inside, helped him warm up by the heater in the teacher's lounge, and offered him a cup of hot chocolate from the vending machine. While he clutched the paper cup in trembling hands, Sarah carefully asked him questions. Daniel's words spilled out in disjointed pieces. Apparently Frank Wells got angry about some minor misstep, something about not finishing chores in time. He told Daniel to spend the night outside if he couldn't follow the rules. Daniel spent hours in the cold, too afraid to knock on the door for fear of further punishment. Eventually, he snuck away and walked to the school because it was the only place he knew he could find warmth in the morning. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she listened, fighting the urge to hug him in that moment. Armed with this startling revelation, Sarah and Mr. Henderson immediately went to Mrs. Garcia. They decided to confront the principal and Ms. Taylor from CPS that very morning. Daniel was taken to the nurse for a full checkup, revealing mild hypothermia and a series of bruises on his torso. The nurse documented everything. Ms. Taylor arrived within an hour, bringing a colleague. They interviewed Daniel again, but he kept glancing at Sarah, as if unsure whether it was truly safe to speak. Finally, he admitted what had happened the night before. The CPS workers exchanged grim looks. This was more than enough evidence for an emergency removal. They made the call on the spot. By the time Ruth and Frank Wells arrived at the school, Miss Taylor had already informed them that Daniel would not be returning home with them. Ruth put on a show of disbelief and indignation, while Frank demanded to see Daniel immediately. The principal, Miss Taylor, and a police officer who had been called in for support stood firm, explaining that Daniel's statements and the medical evidence necessitated immediate intervention. Furious, Frank tried to threaten legal action, and Ruth began wailing about how this was all a misunderstanding. Sarah stood off to the side, her heart pounding as she glimpsed the cold fury in Frank's eyes. She could only imagine what Daniel had endured at home. After a tense confrontation, the Wells stormed out, vowing to sue the school and CPS. Sarah felt a wave of relief for Daniel, though she knew this was only the beginning of a complicated process. Children removed from foster homes often ended up in temporary shelters if another placement wasn't readily available. That evening, Miss Taylor informed Sarah that they were having difficulty finding a suitable emergency placement in the county. Daniel might have to be placed in a group home hours away, pending the outcome of the investigation. The thought of Daniel being uprooted again, sent away from the only teacher he trusted, pained Sarah deeply. She thought about her own life, her empty nest, the quiet house she returned to each day. She had never seriously considered fostering before, especially at her age, but something in her heart tugged persistently. That night, she sat in her living room and remembered the promise she'd made to herself years ago, to always do what was best for her students, to be more than just an instructor of facts and figures, but to be a source of safety and encouragement. The question was whether she was truly prepared to take on a child who had been through so much trauma. She was nearing retirement after all, and had her own health and finances to consider. Still, her conscience wouldn't let her rest. She decided to discuss the idea with Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Garcia. Over the next few days, she discovered that because she was single and over a certain age, the process might be lengthy and the authorities might have reservations. But Miss Taylor told her that, given Daniel's trust in her and the urgent need for stable placement, the county might expedite at least a temporary guardianship. Sarah found herself filling out forms and undergoing background checks, fingerprint scans, and a whirlwind of other formalities. She was nervous and excited, haunted by the question of whether she was doing the right thing for Daniel. In the midst of all this, the investigation against the Wells continued. More disturbing details surfaced. Apparently, Daniel wasn't the first foster child to complain of harsh punishments in that household. A few years prior, another child had told a teacher about being forced to sleep in a shed, but that case was dismissed as inconclusive. The Wells had a knack for presenting themselves as stern but well-meaning caretakers, cleverly masking any evidence of abuse. This time, though, with Daniel's account and the nurse's documentation, the Wells faced the very real prospect of losing their foster license and possibly facing criminal charges if more evidence emerged. As Sarah navigated the bureaucratic maze of fostering, she also had to deal with the emotional turmoil Daniel was experiencing. Temporarily placed in a children's shelter, he would appear at school with a blank expression, as though he couldn't quite process what was happening. Whenever Sarah spoke to him, he'd offer the faintest attempt at a smile, but she could see the shadows in his eyes. She asked him if he'd like to stay with her if it were possible. His eyes flickered with hope, but he shrugged as though he didn't dare to wish for such a thing. "That's up to them," he said quietly, referring to the system that had jerked him around for so long. A week passed, then another. Sarah's nights were filled with phone calls from Miss Taylor, forms to sign, and a stack of documents about foster care regulations. The day she finally got a call confirming that she could become Daniel's temporary guardian, she sat on her couch, her heart hammering. It felt surreal. She looked around her modest home, imagining where Daniel might sleep, where he'd do his homework. She had a guest room that mostly served as an office. It would be his bedroom now. She wondered if she had to buy a new bed, or if the single bed stored in the garage would suffice. In those mundane details, she felt the stirrings of hope. The next day, she asked Daniel if he'd like to come see her house. He nodded with such a solemn seriousness that it broke her heart. That afternoon, Miss Taylor drove him over, and they did a brief inspection, checking the safety of the home, the neighborhood, and ensuring all the necessities were in place. Daniel walked through the rooms quietly, occasionally glancing at old photos of Sarah's late husband or framed pictures of previous classes she taught. He lingered by a dusty upright piano in the living room, running his fingers across the keys without pressing them. "Do you play?" Sarah asked, her tone gentle. He shook his head, but there was a flicker of interest in his eyes. That day ended with Miss Taylor promising that if everything went smoothly with the final paperwork, Daniel could move in soon. When he said goodbye to Sarah, he whispered, "Thank you," so quietly she almost didn't hear it. It was the most honest display of gratitude he'd ever shown. In the following days, the Wells began their campaign to retain custody, hiring a lawyer and claiming they were being unfairly targeted. They insisted Daniel was a troubled boy lying for attention. Sarah worried that the legal mess might drag on and put Daniel's placement in jeopardy. She spoke to Ms. Taylor frequently, worried that Daniel would be caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, the school staff largely sided with Sarah. No one could ignore the bruises, the limp, or the night he showed up cold and shivering. The principal, though initially cautious, now supported Sarah's decision. Even the superintendent made a statement that the welfare of the child was paramount. At the same time, a wave of sympathy for Daniel washed through the community. Some neighbors and parents came to Sarah offering help, hand-me-down clothes, offers to babysit, or simply words of encouragement. Mrs. Garcia arranged for a short session of counseling for Daniel at the school's expense, knowing that the trauma he'd suffered wouldn't vanish overnight. Mr. Henderson, ever the comforting presence, promised to check on them often. He told Sarah quietly, "You're doing a brave thing. You're giving him a chance to heal." One Wednesday afternoon, after the final bell rang, Sarah received a phone call confirming that Daniel's temporary guardianship was approved. The relief she felt was indescribable. She rushed to the shelter and filled out the last pieces of paperwork. Daniel sat in the lobby, shoulders hunched, hugging his worn backpack as though it were his sole possession. "Daniel," she said softly, crouching to meet his gaze, "you're coming home with me." He stared at her for a long moment, tears forming in his eyes. Then he nodded, silently acknowledging the magnitude of that single sentence. Later that evening, they arrived at Sarah's house together. She led Daniel to his new room, where she had set up a simple bed with fresh sheets, a small dresser, and a desk by the window. "It's not fancy," she said apologetically, "but it's all yours." Daniel walked around, touching the walls and furniture as if trying to convince himself it was real. Finally, he turned to Sarah with a shy smile. "Thank you," he said again, and this time his voice was steady. Sarah felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. "You're welcome," she replied, ruffling his hair lightly. "We'll make it work." In the days that followed, an awkward but hopeful routine emerged. Sarah woke Daniel up in the morning, made sure he had breakfast, usually cereal or scrambled eggs, and dropped him off at school. She realized how unfamiliar she was with modern parenting concerns: cell phones, extracurricular signups, dietary preferences. She tried to keep Daniel included in each decision, asking him if he liked certain foods or if he was interested in any after-school clubs. At first, he shrugged and remained reserved, but gradually she saw him open up, even if just a little. One evening, Sarah found Daniel in the living room, standing in front of the upright piano again. She watched from the doorway as he pressed a single key, then quickly pulled his hand back. "You can play it, you know," she said gently, stepping into the room. "It belonged to my husband. He used to love music." Daniel looked uncertain. "I don't know how," he admitted. Sarah smiled. "You can learn." She showed him a few basic notes, and he repeated them, fumbling at first but determined. For the first time, she saw a spark of curiosity in his eyes that didn't come from fear or worry. Meanwhile, the legal battle with the Wells continued. Sarah was subpoenaed to give a statement about Daniel's condition, the bruises, and that night he was forced to sleep outside. The day she testified, she felt a knot in her stomach. She described Daniel's injuries, his emotional state, and the conversation in which he revealed he was kicked out of the house. The Wells lawyer tried to discredit her as a biased teacher who had only known the boy for a short time, but Sarah remained calm, emphasizing that she had documented the signs over months. In the hallway outside the hearing, Frank Wells shot her a menacing glare, while Ruth pointedly ignored her. Sarah's hands trembled, but she squared her shoulders, telling herself that she wasn't the one on trial. Back home, she tried to shield Daniel from the details of the hearings. He didn't ask many questions, but she could see the anxiety in his posture whenever the subject of the Wells came up. She assured him that they were doing everything they could to keep him safe. Sometimes she found him sitting at the desk in his room, writing in his journal. She never asked to read it. She figured the boy deserved some privacy. She hoped he was releasing some of his pent-up fears onto those pages. Slowly but surely, Daniel's bruises began to fade. He still carried the emotional scars, but physically he was healing. He even made a friend at school, a quiet girl named Alicia who liked to read fantasy novels during recess. Sarah noticed them chatting in the corner of the playground one afternoon, their heads bent close as they discussed a story they both loved. It warmed Sarah's heart to see him forging a small connection, taking tentative steps toward normalcy. In early December, a sense of cautious optimism filled Sarah's household. She decorated a small Christmas tree in the living room, placing it near the piano. Daniel helped hang ornaments, some of which were decades old, souvenirs of Sarah's life with her late husband. He asked gentle questions. Did he like music too? And what happened to him? Sarah explained that her husband had passed away after a long illness many years ago. Daniel, in his quiet way, nodded and offered a simple, "I'm sorry." The sincerity in his words made her eyes well with tears. It was around this time that Miss Taylor called with news. The Wells lawyer was pushing for a hearing to argue that Daniel had invented or exaggerated the abuse. They claimed he was manipulating the system to get attention. Miss Taylor needed all the evidence she could gather to support Daniel's account. Sarah brought forward the photographs of bruises she'd taken, the nurse's documentation of his injuries, and the school logs where she and Mrs. Garcia had recorded every suspicious incident. She was worried about Daniel testifying, fearing it would traumatize him further, but Miss Taylor insisted that without his voice, the Wells might spin their narrative without contradiction. One chilly afternoon, Sarah gently broached the topic with Daniel. "They might want you to tell the judge what happened. You can be honest. No one will be mad at you for telling the truth, and I promise I'll be there with you." Daniel paled slightly, his eyes darting to the floor. "I don't want to see them again," he murmured. Sarah put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I understand. This is your choice. But if you do speak up, it might help make sure they can't do this to anyone else." That night, she heard the faint sound of the piano keys being pressed. She peered into the living room, seeing Daniel playing a soft, tentative melody he must have pieced together himself. It was haunting and simple, but there was a rawness to it that tugged at her emotions. She realized he was processing everything the best way he knew how. When he stopped, she applauded gently. She turned, startled, but she just smiled. "That was beautiful," she said, tears in her eyes. He seemed embarrassed but also pleased. The hearing date approached. On the morning they were scheduled to appear in family court, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. He looked nervous, wearing a collared shirt Sarah had bought for him. She offered him a warm breakfast, but he barely ate. "It'll be okay," she kept saying, wishing she could guarantee it. As they drove to the courthouse, Sarah could feel his tension from the passenger seat. When they arrived, Miss Taylor met them in the hallway. "Daniel," she said kindly, "you only have to say what you feel comfortable sharing. We'll take it one step at a time." They were called in. The Wells were already seated, their expressions stoic. Daniel took the stand, his voice trembling at first as the judge asked him to explain how he came to be placed with Sarah. With each question, he glanced at Sarah for reassurance. He recounted the night he was locked out, the bruises, and the tasks he was forced to perform as punishments. His voice wavered, and tears gathered at the corners of his eyes. Ruth Wells shook her head, tears of her own, claiming innocence. Frank sat stiffly, glaring. But as Daniel spoke, the details became undeniable. The medical records matched his accounts. The bruises corresponded with the timeline. When Ruth's lawyer tried to cross-examine Daniel, implying he was lying, Daniel froze. Sarah held her breath. Then, with surprising resolve, he clenched his fists and said, "I'm not lying. I was outside all night. I didn't have anywhere else to go." That simple statement seemed to echo in the courtroom. The lawyer pressed him, asking why he never told anyone before if it was so bad. Daniel replied in a shaky voice, "I was scared. They said no one would believe me." The raw honesty of that statement moved more than a few spectators in the room. Even the judge's expression softened as she asked Daniel a few clarifying questions. When he finished his testimony, tears streaked his face, and Sarah could hardly restrain herself from rushing up to offer him a comforting hug. The rest of the hearing involved testimonies from the nurse, Miss Taylor, and even Mr. Henderson, who spoke of Daniel's withdrawn behavior and the patterns he recognized from his career in social work. In the end, the judge determined there was sufficient evidence of abuse and neglect to terminate the Wells' rights to foster Daniel. The possibility of criminal charges loomed over them, pending further investigation. As Sarah led Daniel out of the courthouse, they felt a collective weight lift. He had done something incredibly brave, but she could tell he was emotionally drained. She drove him home in silence, letting him process the magnitude of what he'd just faced. Back at the house, Daniel headed straight to his room, shutting the door softly. Sarah let him be, recognizing that he probably needed some time alone. Later that evening, when she knocked gently and entered, she found him curled up on his bed, clutching a pillow. He looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "They won't come after me, right?" he whispered. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed. "No," she assured him, stroking his hair. "They can't hurt you anymore." He breathed a shaky sigh of relief. "Then I guess I'm safe," he murmured, his voice laced with wonder. Over the next several days, life seemed more hopeful. Sarah set about the daily routines, helping Daniel with homework, encouraging him to join an after-school art club that Alicia was a part of, making sure he had healthy meals, ensuring he felt loved. Meanwhile, the legal resolution meant that the Wells could no longer lay claim to him. Yet it wasn't an immediate guarantee of a permanent home with Sarah. She had to decide if she was willing to go beyond temporary guardianship. The social worker encouraged her to consider adoption, but also warned her that it was a serious, long-term commitment. Sarah felt conflicted. She was in her early 60s, unsure if she had the energy to raise a preteen boy, uncertain if it was fair to Daniel to have an older guardian who might not be able to keep up with him as he grew. One afternoon, after school, Daniel was practicing a simple tune on the piano. Sarah sat in an armchair, enjoying the gentle rhythm of the notes. When he finished, he turned around and said, "I like it here." She smiled. "I'm glad, Daniel." He paused, looking down at the keys. "I don't want to leave," he added quietly. Sarah felt her heart twist. She knew what he was implying, that eventually, the system might move him to another foster home if she didn't commit to adopting him. She walked over, sat beside him on the piano bench, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I don't want you to leave either," she said softly. That evening, she made a decision. She picked up the phone and called Miss Taylor, saying she wanted to explore the idea of adopting Daniel, or at least obtaining long-term guardianship. She heard the relief in Miss Taylor's voice. "That's wonderful," Miss Taylor said. "We can start the process. There's some paperwork, a few home visits, but given the circumstances and Daniel's bond with you, I'm hopeful it won't be too complicated." Sarah hung up, her nerves on edge, but also feeling a surge of determination. She reflected on her life, on how she'd once dreamed of a big family. She'd almost had that with her late husband, but fate had taken a different turn. Now, in a winding, unexpected path, she might have a chance to become the parent figure Daniel so desperately needed. In the midst of these changes, the holidays approached. Sarah and Daniel prepared for a modest Christmas. Neighbors dropped by with small gifts, like a warm coat for Daniel or homemade cookies. The sense of community support was overwhelming. Mr. Henderson, who had become almost a grandfather figure to Daniel, promised to teach him some basic woodworking in the new year, a skill he swore every child should learn. Mrs. Garcia dropped off a therapeutic coloring book that Daniel might find relaxing. For the first time, the boy seemed to be experiencing genuine warmth from multiple people. Still, the scars of his past remained. At night, Sarah sometimes heard him stir from nightmares. He'd wake up trembling, remembering the nights at the Wells house, the punishments, the cold fear. She would sit by his bed, reassuring him that he was safe now. Each time, He relaxed only after checking that she was truly there, that she wasn't going to abandon him. Sarah found these moments both heartbreaking and affirming. She wanted to be that constant presence in his life, the one who would never turn him away. As the new year inched closer, Daniel grew more comfortable in Sarah's home. He began to decorate his room with small drawings and pictures he found in magazines. He joined the art club at school, practicing sketching and discovering a talent for capturing subtle emotional expressions on paper. Every so often, Sarah caught a glimpse of a sketch featuring a small figure standing in front of a large, foreboding house, overshadowed by a taller, ominous figure. She didn't need to ask to know what he was expressing. Over time, she hoped, art would be his therapy, a way to release the pain he carried. But not everyone welcomed the news about Daniel's improved situation. There were whispers around the community from people who had once admired the Wells. Some insisted Sarah was interfering, that the boy was ungrateful. Others, however, rallied behind her, incensed that such abuse had been allowed to continue for so long under the guise of strict discipline. Whenever Sarah felt self-doubt, she reminded herself of Daniel's transformation, from a terrified, bruised child to a boy tentatively exploring music and art, discovering the joy of belonging. She clung to that as proof she was doing the right thing. At school, there were ripples of tension. The principal, though now supportive, was anxious about the Wells possibly suing. The district's legal counsel advised caution in public statements. Sarah had to direct all inquiries to Ms. Taylor. She found herself balancing her role as Daniel's guardian with her duties to the rest of her students. She made sure Daniel never felt singled out or pitted. Instead, she encouraged him to participate in class discussions, praising his improvements when he mustered the courage to speak up. Slowly, he began to smile more, and even made a second friend, a boy named Carlos who loved the same adventure novels as Daniel. One cold afternoon in early December, Daniel approached Sarah in the classroom when everyone else had gone home. "Ms. Carter," he began, hesitating. "Can I do something for the Winter Talent Show?" The school planned a small event where students could showcase music, dance, or any special skill. Sarah was taken aback because Daniel had never expressed such an extroverted desire. "Of course," she said, beaming. "What do you have in mind?" He glanced at his feet. "Maybe I could try to play the piano? I've been practicing a simple piece." Tears almost welled up in Sarah's eyes. "That's a wonderful idea," she encouraged him. "I'll help you get ready if you want." And so, after school, Daniel would practice on the old upright piano in the music room, with Sarah occasionally dropping in to listen. He had a tentative but earnest approach, stumbling over notes but always persevering. He chose a simple classical piece, nothing too ambitious, but melodic enough to move an audience. Sarah saw a quiet determination in him that spoke volumes. This was a boy reclaiming some sense of worth, using music to express himself in ways words never could. As the night of the Winter Talent Show approached, Daniel grew more nervous. He asked Sarah if he really had to perform in front of everyone. "Only if you want to," she reminded him gently. "It's your choice." She noticed he looked torn, as if part of him wanted to prove something, while another part remained terrified of being scrutinized. The evening of the event arrived with a chill in the air. The cafeteria had been transformed into a makeshift auditorium, complete with rows of folding chairs facing a small stage. Parents, teachers, and students filled the space, chattering excitedly. Daniel paced backstage, his hands trembling. He wore a simple sweater and pants, nothing flashy, but neat. When it was his turn, Sarah gave him a reassuring nod. He walked out onto the stage, the bright lights illuminating his thin frame. She could see him swallow, hands shaking slightly as he sat at the keyboard. He paused, closed his eyes, and began to play. The first notes were hesitant, but then he found his rhythm. The audience fell silent, drawn in by the earnestness of his performance. Halfway through, his foot slipped on the pedal, causing a jarring note. He winced, his fingers freezing momentarily. Sarah's heart lurched. She prayed he wouldn't panic and run off. Then she saw him take a breath, gather himself, and continue playing. The piece ended to modest applause. He wasn't a virtuoso, but in that moment, he was courageous in a way that no one else in that room likely understood. Sarah rushed to him as he stood up, face flushed. "You did great," she whispered, hugging him briefly. He looked uncertain until he realized people were still clapping, especially Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Garcia, who were seated in the front row. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. For Sarah, it was a profound moment. Here was a child who had been so afraid to even speak some months ago, now daring to share his efforts in front of an audience. After the show, Alicia and Carlos ran up to Daniel, congratulating him. He mumbled a thank you, his cheeks pink. The pride in Sarah's heart felt almost maternal. She realized that, at some point, she had come to love this boy not just as a student but as someone she wanted to protect and nurture forever. That night, she tucked him into his new bed, noticing how relaxed he seemed. The nightmares had grown less frequent. He whispered a quiet, "Good night, Sarah," a statement of trust and belonging. She turned off the light, feeling that this was only the beginning of the life they could build together, if he wanted it, and if the system allowed. Yet there was still a final piece of business, the hearing to finalize whether the Wells would face charges and whether Sarah's guardianship could become permanent. In the weeks leading up to it, Sarah was on edge, worried that any legal complication might tear Daniel away again or drag out the process. She had heard rumors the Wells had hired a new lawyer specializing in defense for foster families accused of maltreatment. She tried to keep Daniel shielded from these worries, focusing on the warmth of the holidays and the blossoming sense of routine in their home. As they lit a small Christmas tree in the living room, Daniel asked her hesitantly, "What happens if a judge says I have to leave?" Sarah carefully set an ornament in place before turning to him. "If that happens," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "we'll fight it. We have so many people on our side. I promise I won't let you go back to a home where you don't feel safe." He nodded, though fear still lingered in his eyes. During the last week before winter break, Daniel made Sarah a card in art club. On the front was a simple drawing of a house with warm light shining from its windows. Inside, he wrote in shaky handwriting, "Thank you for giving me a place I can call home." Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears as she read it. No matter the obstacles ahead, she knew she would do everything in her power to keep him safe, to keep him in that place where he could truly feel at home. Sarah could sense the tension building in the weeks that led up to the hearing that would finalize Daniel's future. Even though they had established a day-to-day routine, an undercurrent of uncertainty lingered in the air. She knew the Wells were still trying to salvage their image by spinning stories about Daniel being a troublesome child. According to rumors that reached her, they claimed they had never laid a hand on him and that he'd fabricated every accusation to manipulate the system. Sometimes, when the phone rang late at night, Sarah expected to hear either bad news from Miss Taylor or, worse, some threatening message. She remained vigilant, keeping her door locked and rarely letting Daniel out of her sight. He deserved the security of knowing he was truly safe. In the days following the talent show, Sarah saw encouraging changes in Daniel. He carried himself with a bit more confidence at school, occasionally offering a smile to other children. During lunch, she'd peek through the cafeteria window and see him chatting with Alicia and Carlos. The conversations seemed lighthearted, an exchange of jokes, discussions about favorite art styles, a few scattered daydreams about the upcoming winter break. The bruises had healed, leaving behind faint traces that were difficult to notice unless you knew to look for them. But she could see that the emotional wounds were far from gone. Sometimes, in the middle of a math lesson, Daniel's gaze would drift toward the window, and Sarah imagined he might be worrying about the next hearing or replaying painful memories. They spent a quiet Sunday in mid-December sorting through old photographs in Sarah's living room, a task she'd been postponing for years. She wanted to find a few pictures that might brighten the house for the holidays. Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully examining each photo she handed him. Most were images of her and her late husband in happier times: vacations by the lake, Christmas gatherings, birthdays. At first, Daniel just studied them silently. Eventually, he asked questions. Did you two play music together? Did he teach you how to cook? The gentle curiosity in his voice felt like a bridge, linking their experiences. Sarah answered each question, sharing small anecdotes. The time her husband tried to bake a cake and ended up burning half the kitchen towels, or the time they spent an entire night listening to old records, dancing until dawn. Daniel's eyes crinkled when he found something funny, and sometimes he tilted his head to the side, letting her know he was intrigued. Sarah realized she was opening a window into her past for him, and in doing so, she was making him part of her present. It was a strange, comforting feeling. When they were done, she selected a couple of pictures to put in frames around the house, including one of her younger self standing beside the piano, a moment that almost felt like destiny now that Daniel had found solace in that very same instrument. After tidying up, they moved on to an impromptu cooking lesson, with Sarah showing Daniel how to make simple sugar cookies. He watched the mixing process with a mix of fascination and unease, as though part of him worried he might be punished for doing something incorrectly. She reassured him repeatedly, "Don't worry if you spill a little flour. It's part of the fun." By the end of it, the kitchen counter was dusted in white, and they were both laughing at the sight. Daniel took a bite of a warm cookie straight from the oven, his eyes lighting up. It struck Sarah how rare these carefree moments must have been for him. Later that night, she found him in his room, looking over a few art sketches. He hesitated as she stepped inside, then he pointed to one piece of paper where he'd drawn a small figure playing a piano in a cozy room. There was another figure behind him, which Sarah recognized as herself, albeit in a simplified form. A kind face with glasses, hair tied back in a neat bun. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "That's lovely, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He offered a small smile. "I like drawing how I feel," he admitted softly. "It's easier than talking sometimes." Sarah reached out and gently squeezed his shoulder. "Anytime you want to draw or talk or play music, I'm here," she replied. As winter break approached, the school corridors were abuzz with holiday excitement. Teachers decorated classrooms with paper snowflakes, and students organized small parties before everyone dispersed for the 2-week break. Daniel had never been a fan of social gatherings, but this time, he participated in his class's secret Santa exchange. He drew Alicia's name. With Sarah's help, he picked out a small set of colored pencils and a sketch pad, neatly wrapping them in bright paper. He insisted on writing her a short note too. Watching him add the finishing touches filled Sarah's heart with pride. It was another small victory, a sign he was connecting with peers and learning the simple joys of giving. On the last day of school before the break, Sarah found a homemade card on her desk. Inside it was a hand-drawn Christmas tree covered in ornaments. Beneath the tree, Daniel had sketched a small figure of himself and a taller figure wearing a knee-length dress, undoubtedly meant to be Sarah, holding hands. The words, "Thank you for everything. I feel safe now," were written underneath in a shaky scrawl. She blinked back tears, carefully slipping the card into her bag. She realized that no matter what happened next, she'd treasure that piece of paper for the rest of her life. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Sarah had promised Daniel a quiet but warm holiday at home, followed by the hearing that would determine if she could officially adopt him or secure permanent guardianship. Although the hearing weighed heavily on her mind, she tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. They decorated the living room with a second-hand wreath, set out some small gifts under the tree, and even put a few lights outside. Daniel helped by carefully winding them around the porch railing, grinning when they lit up the chilly evening. At night, he practiced the piano. Sometimes, Sarah joined him, humming along to a simple carol or flipping through the sheet music to find a new tune. On Christmas Eve, they sat together at the kitchen table, sharing a dinner of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. It was nothing fancy, but Sarah made sure it was the kind of comforting meal that made the house smell like warmth and belonging. Daniel ate quietly but with evident appetite. Afterward, they moved to the couch to watch an old holiday movie. The plot was predictable: Santa, reindeer, the usual, but Daniel watched it with rapt attention, occasionally asking Sarah questions about the characters' motivations. She realized he was processing the idea of a loving family portrayed on screen and comparing it with his own experiences. When the movie ended, Daniel leaned his head on her shoulder for a brief moment, a gesture of trust she didn't take lightly. Morning arrived with pale winter sunlight filtering through the curtains. Daniel woke to find a small pile of presents under the tree. Sarah told him to open them at his own pace. She'd chosen a few practical items: warm sweaters, sturdy shoes, and one purely indulgent gift: a beginner's music book for piano. The grin on Daniel's face was priceless as he flipped through the pages, recognizing a few tunes from the practice sessions. He set the book carefully on the coffee table, as if it were a prized possession. In turn, Daniel handed Sarah a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple handmade ornament shaped like a piano, crafted out of cardboard and painted black. She blinked back tears, hugging him. He returned the hug, shy but firm. The two of them spent the rest of Christmas Day in a contented haze. They baked more cookies, listened to holiday music on the radio, and Daniel tried out some of the pieces in his new music book. That evening, after dinner, the phone rang. It was Ms. Taylor, calling with final instructions for the hearing scheduled just after New Year's. "Sarah, it should go smoothly," Ms. Taylor told her. "We've got documentation, testimonies, everything. But I won't lie to you, sometimes these things get complicated. The Wells' new lawyer is known for being aggressive in court, especially about procedural issues. Just be prepared." Sarah thanked her, feeling a tightness in her chest. She glanced at Daniel, who was leaning around the corner to see who was on the phone. She forced a reassuring smile, promising she'd do all she could to secure their future together. That night, as she tried to fall asleep, her mind raced through worst-case scenarios. She pictured the Wells somehow convincing a judge that Daniel's injuries were all staged or that the school manipulated him into lying. She rolled onto her side, taking deep breaths to calm herself. She reminded herself of the evidence they had: the nurse's records, pictures, Daniel's own testimony, the night he was forced to sleep outside in the cold. She had faith the truth would stand, but fear lingered like a persistent shadow. When the new year arrived, it carried a heavy sense of anticipation. The hearing was scheduled for the first week of January, and Sarah felt as though everything that had happened so far would now come to a head. Daniel was nervous too. She could see it in the way he tapped his pencil on his homework at night, a restless beat that betrayed his anxiety. She told him gently, "Try to trust the process, Daniel. I know it's scary, but we have good people in our corner." He nodded, though she could see the doubt in his eyes. After all, he'd been let down by adults before. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and cold. Sarah dressed Daniel in a neat outfit: a light blue collared shirt, dark slacks, and dress shoes. He fussed with the cuffs, claiming they felt weird, but otherwise didn't complain. She saw he was biting his lip, something he did when he was especially anxious. On the drive to the courthouse, neither of them spoke much. The roads were slick with melting snow, and Sarah focused on driving carefully while stealing glances at Daniel, who stared out the window as if memorizing every building they passed. They arrived early, meeting Miss Taylor and a small group of supporters in a waiting area outside the courtroom. Mr. Henderson was there as well, offering a quiet smile to Daniel. Mrs. Garcia had come in person, determined to show her backing. "We're all here for you," she told Daniel, reaching out to give his shoulder a supportive squeeze. Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. Then they took their seats in the courtroom. The judge, an older man with gray hair and a stern expression, called the session to order. He explained the purpose of this hearing: to determine whether the Wells' rights were to be permanently terminated and whether the court should grant Sarah Carter the authority to adopt or assume permanent guardianship of Daniel. The Wells arrived with their lawyer, a sharp-faced man who wore an expensive-looking suit. Ruth had her hair pulled back in a severe bun, and Frank sat beside her, arms crossed. Their expressions were ice-cold as they scanned the room, and Sarah felt a twinge of dread when their eyes settled on Daniel. Miss Taylor and the school's attorney presented the evidence they had painstakingly gathered: photos of Daniel's bruises and injuries, medical records documenting hypothermia, and statements from Sarah, Mr. Henderson, and Mrs. Garcia. Each took the stand in turn. Sarah recounted her discovery of Daniel outside the school doors that frigid morning, locked out of his own home. She described her systematic documentation of his bruises and how Daniel's behavior changed over time. When asked why she wanted to adopt him, she spoke with quiet conviction: because he deserves a loving, stable home. He's thrived since being in my care, and I believe I can continue to provide for him physically, emotionally, and academically. Ruth and Frank's lawyer then attempted to poke holes in the story. He claimed the bruises could have been self-inflicted or results of normal childhood play. He implied Sarah had taken advantage of Daniel's background to gain sympathy. "Isn't it true," he said to her, "that you're merely a teacher who's become emotionally attached and is exaggerating the situation?" Sarah remained calm, remembering Ms. Taylor's advice. "I am his teacher, and I am emotionally invested," she replied, "but I've spent many years working with children, and I know the difference between accidental bruises and the pattern of abuse. Daniel's case matches what I've seen reported in abuse situations before." Ruth took the stand, tears glistening in her eyes as she insisted she and her husband had done their best for Daniel. "He came to us with behavioral problems," she claimed, voice wavering. "We gave him chores to teach responsibility. We disciplined him when necessary, but we never harmed him. I don't understand why he's saying these things. We've fostered many children before." Frank, on his turn, doubled down, portraying Daniel as a manipulative boy who was trying to get attention. He even accused Daniel of stealing money from Ruth's wallet, an allegation for which they offered no proof. Daniel watched all this from his seat, tense as a coil. When the time came for him to speak, the judge asked if he was comfortable sharing his experiences. Daniel nodded, though his voice trembled. He recounted in more detail than ever before the punishments Frank had inflicted, how he was once forced to scrub floors for hours, how they'd taken away his coat and shoes for small infractions, how he'd been pushed and grabbed. His eyes filled with tears when he described the night he'd spent outside in the cold. Ruth's face reddened with either anger or shame. The lawyer tried to trip Daniel up with tricky questions about dates and times, but Daniel mostly kept his composure, glancing at Sarah for reassurance. "I'm not lying," he insisted. "I was scared they'd hurt me more if I told before." The hearing stretched on for hours, each side presenting evidence, questioning witnesses, and offering closing statements. Sarah could barely breathe as the judge announced he would recess briefly to review the evidence and reconvene in the afternoon with his decision. Daniel sagged in relief when they were given a short break. Sarah led him out to the hallway, where they sat on a bench. Mrs. Garcia handed him a bottle of water, and Mr. Henderson offered a comforting squeeze of his shoulder. "Whatever happens," Mr. Henderson said softly, "you've done an incredible job telling your story." By mid-afternoon, everyone was called back inside. The tension in the courtroom felt almost tangible, an invisible cord stretched tight. The judge began by thanking both sides for their presentations. Then he looked directly at Daniel, who shifted nervously in his seat. "Young man, I believe you when you say you were mistreated," the judge said. His voice was calm but resolute. "The evidence supports your testimony, and I see no credible counterargument from the Wells that would explain the documented injuries and the night you were found in the cold." Ruth let out a strangled gasp, while Frank's expression darkened. The judge continued, turning to them. "Given the pattern that has emerged, I'm terminating your rights to foster Daniel. You will be subject to further investigation for potential criminal charges. For now, your license is revoked." Sarah squeezed Daniel's hand, feeling an overwhelming surge of relief. The judge next addressed her. "Ms. Carter, you have stepped up for this child in an extraordinary way. The documents from Child Protective Services indicate a strong bond, and your willingness to adopt is commendable. I'm granting you legal guardianship effective immediately, with the adoption process to proceed upon completion of the remaining requirements. Congratulations, and young man, I hope you find continued healing in your new home." A hush fell over the courtroom, quickly broken by the subdued cheers of Mrs. Garcia and Mr. Henderson. Ruth started to protest, but the judge simply banged the gavel, signaling the session was over. Frank stood, muttering under his breath, and stalked out with their lawyer trailing behind. Daniel looked dazed, as though he couldn't quite believe what had happened. Sarah turned to him, tears filling her eyes. "It's done," she whispered. He stared at her for a long moment, then wrapped his arms around her in a tight hug. She felt his chest heaving with sobs of relief, and she cradled him, offering whatever comfort she could. That evening, they returned home in a state of cautious celebration. Sarah cooked a simple dinner, nothing elaborate, but it felt like a feast after such a monumental day. She called Miss Taylor to thank her for all her help. Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Garcia stopped by briefly, offering hugs and kind words. Daniel, overwhelmed, quickly excused himself to his room after they left, saying he needed a moment alone. Sarah understood. It was a lot for anyone to process, let alone a child who had been living in fear for so long. Later, she found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at a spot on the floor. "Hey," she said softly, sitting beside him. "Are you okay?" He nodded, then glanced at her with eyes that were still puffy from crying. I never thought this would actually happen. I thought they'd figure out a way to keep me." She gently brushed a hand over his hair. "No, they won't. They can't hurt you anymore. The judge believed you." He swallowed hard, a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill. "So this is real? I can stay here? Forever?" She pulled him into a hug. "Yes, you can. I promise." Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Daniel settled into a new kind of normal. There was no longer the looming dread of court hearings or the possibility of him being taken away. He still attended therapy sessions arranged by Mrs. Garcia, where he began slowly unpacking the trauma of his past. Sometimes old nightmares revisited him, but Sarah was always there to reassure him it was over. Each day, he seemed to grow more comfortable. He even let her sign him up for a short piano course at a local community center, taught by an older gentleman who had once been a professional pianist. Daniel was timid at first, but the instructor's gentle enthusiasm unlocked something in him. Soon he was practicing with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to master a piece he had struggled with before. In the community, reactions were mixed. Most of the faculty at the school were thrilled for Daniel, relieved that justice had been served. A handful of parents who had once defended the Wells either apologized for their misplaced trust or quietly distanced themselves from the topic. Local gossip eventually died down, overshadowed by holiday events and other news. Sarah stayed focused on Daniel, ensuring he felt supported in every aspect of his life. She helped him with homework, encouraged him to read new books, and introduced him to basic life skills, everything from doing laundry to budgeting for groceries. She wanted him to feel capable and confident, to know that the future held possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. The adoption process itself was a formality. Sarah underwent an extended series of home visits, interviews, and background checks, all of which she passed without issue. She filled out pages of paperwork, feeling both impatient and excited. Daniel had little to do except wait, which sometimes made him restless. He told Sarah he worried about random complications, bureaucratic errors, lost forms, or some technicality the Wells might exploit. Sarah tried to soothe those fears, reminding him that Miss Taylor was watching over the process diligently. By early spring, they received the official date for the adoption finalization. On that day, a few close friends joined them in a small courtroom ceremony. Mrs. Garcia and Mr. Henderson were there, along with the piano instructor who'd grown fond of Daniel. The judge, another, younger woman this time, went through the motions with an air of warmth. She explained in simple terms what the adoption meant, that Sarah Carter would henceforth be Daniel's legal parent, with all the rights and responsibilities therein. Daniel stood beside Sarah, dressed in a neat button-down shirt, looking both nervous and excited. When asked if he wanted to say anything, he simply said, "Thank you," his voice cracking a bit. Sarah squeezed his hand. As the judge announced the adoption was finalized, a ripple of applause filled the small chamber. Sarah embraced Daniel, smiling through tears. "You're stuck with me now," she teased gently, and he grinned, wiping at his eyes. Afterward, they celebrated with a modest lunch at a local diner. Daniel ordered a burger and a milkshake, clearly enjoying the treat. Mr. Henderson snapped a few photos, capturing the moment for posterity. In one shot, Daniel was looking straight at the camera, a genuine smile on his face, while Sarah leaned in happily. She promised herself she'd frame that picture and place it next to the photos she kept of her husband. It represented the merging of her past with her future, bound by a boy who had found a second chance at childhood. From that day on, Daniel's daily life took on a brighter rhythm. He thrived at school, bolstered by the security of knowing he had someone to return to, someone who wouldn't hurt or abandon him. His teachers noted improvements in his focus and creativity. Alicia and Carlos remained his closest friends, and he occasionally invited them over to Sarah's house, where they would play board games or simply chat. It warmed Sarah's heart to hear the sound of children's laughter in her living room again. She marveled at how easily Daniel could slip into the role of a typical kid now that he was free from fear. Still, healing wasn't a straight line. Some nights, Sarah found Daniel sitting quietly on his bed, staring at the floor, old anxieties gnawing at him. When she'd ask, he'd admit he sometimes worried that something might happen to Sarah, leaving him alone again. She reassured him the best she could, telling him no one could predict the future but emphasizing that she had every intention of being there for him. She made sure he understood that, even if she became ill or faced challenges, she had arrangements to ensure he'd never go back to the system. Over time, Daniel seemed to accept that security, though the occasional flicker of doubt in his eyes reminded her just how fragile the trust of an abused child could be. Music became a form of therapy for Daniel. He grew more confident with the piano, even composing small melodies that reflected his moods. Sometimes, they were light and playful, other times softly melancholic. One evening, he summoned the courage to ask Sarah if he could learn a more advanced classical piece. She laughed gently, "I'm no expert, but your teacher will help." Indeed, his instructor was thrilled to see such enthusiasm. For Sarah, that single request symbolized a significant step forward. Daniel wanted something challenging, something that implied a future he was planning for and believing in. Spring melted into summer, bringing with it long, warm days. After the school year ended, Sarah enrolled Daniel in a local art camp, where he could hone his drawing skills. He was hesitant at first, worried he wouldn't know anyone, but within a week he was bringing home sketches brimming with color and detail. He drew landscapes, fantasy creatures, and, sometimes, small autobiographical scenes, like him and Sarah in the kitchen making cookies, or him playing piano in front of a small audience. These personal pieces were the most poignant, and Sarah quietly made a space on her walls to hang a few. Daniel would blush when she displayed his work, but she could tell he appreciated her pride in him. Meanwhile, the legal aftermath for the Wells played out in the background. They faced charges for child endangerment, and though the outcome didn't garner huge media attention, word spread in the community. It led to a reevaluation of the foster care system, prompting new checks and balances to prevent such situations from slipping through the cracks in the future. Occasionally, Sarah heard snippets of gossip. Ruth had taken a plea deal, Frank was fighting the charges, but none of it directly affected Daniel anymore. He was out of their grasp forever, and that knowledge helped him sleep more soundly at night. The summer passed in a lazy rhythm of piano practice, art projects, and visits from Mr. Henderson. Mrs. Garcia stopped by a few times, amazed at Daniel's progress. By August, he was preparing to enter a new grade level with renewed confidence. One balmy afternoon, as Sarah sorted through supplies for the upcoming school year, Daniel approached her with a small notebook in hand. "I wanted to show you something," he said. It was the journal she'd given him months ago, which had mostly stayed private. He flipped through the pages, showing sketches and paragraphs describing his experiences, the fear, the loneliness, and the moments he began to trust Sarah. One passage read, "Ms. Carter saved me from the darkest place. I didn't know people could be this kind." Sarah's throat tightened as she read those words. "I'm just so proud of you," she said, tears glistening. He nodded, closing the journal. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he whispered. She ruffled his hair gently. "Never," she promised. They shared a lingering hug, both fully aware of the journey they'd taken together, from frightened boy and concerned teacher to mother and son. As autumn rolled around, they marked 1 year since Daniel's arrival in Sarah's classroom. The leaves turned golden, and the air carried a familiar crispness. On a quiet Saturday, Sarah found Daniel at the piano, practicing a medley of simple tunes he'd learned over the months. She listened from the doorway, marveling at how much he'd grown, not just physically but emotionally. When he finished, she approached and sat beside him on the bench. He looked at her, cheeks flushed with a blend of bashfulness and pride. "You know," Sarah said softly, "it was this time last year I first noticed something wasn't right. I remember seeing that bruise on your arm and feeling my heart drop." Daniel bowed his head. "I remember. I was so scared back then. I didn't think anybody would help me." They sat in silence for a moment, the memory of that fear still poignant. Finally, Sarah spoke. "You've come so far, Daniel. I hope you know that." He nodded, eyes misty. Then he placed his fingers on the keys again, playing a slow, hopeful tune that filled the living room with a gentle warmth. They went about the rest of their day, grocery shopping, tidying the house, preparing a simple dinner. That night, before bed, Daniel told Sarah he'd started another drawing he wanted her to see. In his room, taped to the wall, was a half-finished sketch depicting a small boy standing beside an older woman in a sunlit field. They both looked forward as if gazing at something promising in the distance. "It's about the future," Daniel explained, pausing to brush a bit of pencil dust away. "I want to draw us walking towards that. Whatever it is. It feels bright." Sarah wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "It is bright," she agreed. They stood there, side by side, absorbing the picture. She could almost feel the warmth emanating from the scene. Tomorrow might bring new challenges, school tests, everyday conflicts, or unexpected hurdles. But for Daniel and Sarah, the worst of the darkness lay behind them. They had found each other, defied a broken system, and forged a bond stronger than either had dared hope for. Their story, then, was not simply about escaping abuse. It was also about discovering the power of love, resilience, and second chances. Through bruises, fear, and loneliness, they had emerged into a space of understanding and acceptance. Sarah looked at Daniel, and he looked back at her, a flicker of a smile on his lips. In that silent exchange, they both affirmed what they already knew, that they were family now, and they would face whatever came next as mother and son. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.